So thanks everyone for bearing with us. This is our first time doing an event like this, so we're still figuring out some of the workflow basically of how to get something like this up and running. But I'm really excited for this, and I'm excited to hopefully keep doing these. I would love for this to be a space where we can just sort of get together and talk about topics that are important in the world right now, and to do so in a way that's like in community with the people living around us. So for anybody, and we're going to be recording this and posting it afterwards, so both for anybody listening live virtually right now and for everybody listening in posterity, this podcast is being done from LTC's gallery. LTC is the Lowell Telemedia Center, Lowell's nonprofit public access TV station. And part of our mission is making the means of media production accessible to everybody here in our community, and making the means of education accessible as well. And that's what this is part of. So before I go any further, I do want to invite my colleague Wednesday up just to say something about another live stream, which is going to be happening from here in the not too distant future.
Hi guys, this is Wednesday. If you're listening to this, it's probably not tomorrow, so you might miss the live stream workshop. But for those who are present, there is going to be a live stream workshop tomorrow at 12 p.m. Here in the gallery, where Alex Dadarian from ICAM is going to go over basic setup and answer any questions about that. But for you listeners at home, there's also going to be a couple more workshops. There's going to be intro to interviewing at the end of the month, as well as one more workshop, let's see, Studio A, which is next Tuesday. And then on October 15th, we're going to be having a screening of shorts from local filmmakers and video artists and even podcasters. So if you are interested in making one of those, send it over to me. All right, I'll hand the mic back over.
Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, this is the first installment of what we're hoping is going to be a new series called Under Discussion at LTC. And I'm really honored that our first guest is Dr. Mariko Frame, Assistant Professor of Economics at Merrimack College. Would you want to introduce yourself and tell folks a little bit about what you do?
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me, Dan. I think this is a wonderful concept, and I'm really honored to be your first speaker. I teach economics at Merrimack College, and I'm actually a political economist, meaning I really study the political underpinnings of the economy, and I focus a lot on global North and global South relations. And I've been writing about the topic of imperialism and the environment and neocolonialism for a number of years now. So yeah, thanks. I look forward to this discussion.
Yeah, me too. And for everybody who's listening, a lot of this discussion is going to be based on a forthcoming book that Mariko has written, which you were kind enough to let me read a draft of. Well, it's pretty much done, right?
It's done.
It's
yeah.
done. Yeah.
It's done.
And it's coming out in the fall. Okay. And it's entitled, see, I'm pulling it up right here. So it's entitled Ecological Imperialism, Development, and the Capitalist World System, Cases from Africa and Asia. And how long have you been working on this for?
The book I've been working on for the past, it's 3.5 years just about, but this particular topic I've been working on since my dissertation and as a PhD student. So it's basically almost since 2010.
And could you, for anybody who, well, I don't think anyone else here has read it actually, other than us, but could you lay out for folks what the book's about and what the arguments that you're making in it are?
Okay, I'll try to.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's a big ask
considering,
yeah, you just said you've been working on it for years, but.
Okay, well, I would hope that everybody who's listening to this conversation and everybody in the room right now is aware of the fact that humanity is really undergoing an extraordinary time period of escalating environmental issues, ranging from climate change, but not just climate change, which gets most of the attention, but also a massive extinction rate, escalating levels of chemical pollution and waste, collapse of ocean stocks. So we're in a rather unique time period, and I think that is the motivation for writing this book, is to take a deeper look at some of the structural causes behind this and to put a critical lens on it, to put it in a historical context, stretching back from colonialism, which it might sound like it was a long time ago, but really colonialism didn't end until like 1960s, early 1960s. And also to take the critical look and perspective, which is something that activists and intellectuals from the global South have been saying for a very long time, is that this ecological crisis is, it's not driven by everybody. In a lot of ways, we are all plugged into it as consumers or as workers, but the responsibility for it it's not equitably shared by everybody. So I wanted to look at that story of things like ecological debt with the global South, climate debt, because these are emerging conversations. They're movements, they're resistances. If we look at the United Nations climate proposals, there's indigenous groups, activists, there's groups from the global South who are talking about these issues of debt, of ecological debt, that the global North owes to the global South. The global North is generally defined as countries like United States, Europe, Japan, the wealthier industrialized countries. And the global South, that can be Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia, not all of Asia. Some of Asia might be considered global North at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I there's so much in this book, and I really enjoyed reading it firstly, and I would urge anybody who can get access to it when it comes out to give it a read. One of the things that I thought it did really well is give sort of a broad and brief overview of the movement from colonialism through national liberation movements into the imposition of neoliberalism, and specifically to frame each of those moments as reacting to the dynamics of the preceding moment in really specific ways. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of sketch out the story that you tell in the book here.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So here's a very brief overview of colonialism, hundreds of years of colonialism in 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I keep asking you to I'm like distill everything down into
No.
a 20-second. Yeah.
No, this is part of my job as a professor.
Mhm.
It's not like humans have not exploited each other for resources before, or that humans have not conquered each other before with civilizations or with empires. It's just that the current patterns that we see in the world today in terms of what countries produce, the current patterns of ecological debt, the current patterns of industrialization and who benefits from it while other people suffer the consequences from it, these really began with the beginnings of colonialism. And it's not a story that a lot of people know, because we don't learn about colonialism in this country. For some reason, it's just kind of excised from our education. It's not something we learn about in the media. And basically, really from the very beginnings of colonialism, Spanish colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, all the way through British colonialism, German colonialism, a lot of it was centered around resources, because essentially precious metals, later minerals, metals, cash crops, timber, all of these things were extracted from the colonies in order to fuel the industrialization of the European countries. And these were done forcibly, just like the slave trade was a forcible removal of Africans to places throughout the Americas for their labor. And countries throughout Africa, throughout Latin America, most people aren't aware, the countries that we see today were created under colonialism. Their national boundaries were created by the colonizers, not by the African people or the indigenous people in the Americas. The colonial powers in Europe got together and they basically looked at a map and they said, okay, the English want this or the Germans want that, and we're going to draw up the political boundaries. And the colonial states that were imposed included administrations where the purpose was really to rule the indigenous populations and to make sure that the colonial powers could have access to things like cotton, indigo, rubber, tin, whatever was needed for the industrialization of Europe, which was happening in the 1800s, essentially, because industrialization requires a tremendous amount of resources, and that is not something that has gone away today. All countries, as they industrialize, even after they are well developed like the United States or Europe, are tremendously resource intensive. And I wanted to make sure that my readers understood the beginnings of this. Now, we had this colonial system. It ended in various parts of the world, depending on which region. Latin America was earlier, but Africa was pretty late. It's like early 1960s. And when the post-colonial countries gained independence, they realized that they really only gained political independence, but they didn't gain economic independence. Much of their economies were still under the subjugation or the control of the colonial powers, their former colonial masters, including vital industries, including their natural resource sectors. So the the post-colonial countries, they engaged in a variety of something that I kind of lumped together in the book as a category called economic nationalism, but it's a category that contains a lot of different economic experiments. And what we don't really study about, again, in the US is this time period where these countries were trying to assert their independence. They were trying to make sure that they could regulate the multinational corporations that were operating within their borders that belonged to the former colonial powers. They were engaging in platforms through the United Nations, like the New International Economic Order, that demanded reparations for colonialism, that demanded better terms of trade for their natural resources, that demanded non-interference in their economies, especially no threat of military interference from the more powerful countries. They demanded technology transfer, and they demanded the ability to do things like form primary commodity cartels, things like for bauxite or for oil, in order to control their prices. So what we really had during this time period of economic nationalism is something that was basically viewed as a threat to the first world countries, because it was a threat to their multinational corporations that were becoming nationalized or regulated. It was a threat to the first world nations having access, easy access, cheap access to the natural resources of the global South. And this threat, it wasn't welcome by the United States or Western Europe. It was definitely seen as a threat, the threat of third world militancy. economic nationalism really came crashing down by the 1980s for a number of complicated reasons. A lot of these countries went into debt. They found it very difficult to sustain their economic alternatives that they were engaging in. And especially they found that they couldn't get out of an increasing debt. You know, they're still reliant on things like importing technology from the first world countries. First world countries still really had hegemony over finance. And there were a series of events that happened, I would say late 1970s, early 1980s, which led to a widespread debt crisis throughout the developing world. And then what we had is this backlash, which a lot of critical scholars would call neoliberalism. Should I continue on with the story of neoliberalism, or you want to?
I mean, I'm trying to think of where the moment to jump in with this is. One of the things that your book made me think of was a while ago. I had read another book called Bad Samaritans by Ha-Joon Chung, which is about exactly sort of the moment that we're just approaching in this this narrative about how multinational financial actors like the World Bank or the IMF were able to impose policies on countries coming out of economic nationalism, as you phrase it, coming out of that, which were actually exactly opposite the sort of policies that the countries which had developed sort of robust internal economies had implemented to get there. A lot of those countries had been, I mean, America definitely, the UK going further back, actually before we can even say the UK, but sort of really stringently protectionist policies, often quite, often with attitudes towards intellectual property that the IMF and World Bank don't take kindly to anymore. But the thing that, and in that book, it's referred to as kicking away the ladder, because these developed nations don't give other nations the chance to implement the same policies that allowed them to reach the level of industrialization that they're at, or the level of yeah. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about your book and its focus, especially on the ecological consequences of that, is I think the frame that it brings to a conversation around something like kicking away the ladder is that those policies always depended on the availability of cheap natures from global South countries to actually to for those countries to be able to industrialize the way that they were. So it's not like these things are all happening in a global system. None of it is. We can't isolate individual nations and say this nation was able to implement the right policies, therefore X, and that nation wasn't. So why? And I guess, before we jump on to the part of the narrative about neoliberalism, do you think that the focus on ecological resources brings an important sort of grounding to thinking through the way that this all played out?
I think it does. I think I've read, maybe not the book, but I've read an article, Kicking Away the Ladder.
Mm-hmm.
It's something it's brought up quite a bit in political economy. For its critics, neoliberalism has often been seen as a backlash against labor. Okay. Just to talk a little bit about the history of neoliberalism, which has a number of different names. Can be free market economics. It can be laissez-faire. And the kind of intellectual school which it comes from is neoclassical economics, which is the main school of economics that's taught today. I still teach it in my courses. I'm critically, but you got to learn it if you're going to be teaching, if you're going to be taking a course on economics. That time period post World War II until the 70s was a time period of a variety of economic experiments that had greater role for the state. Now that could range from full-on socialism in some countries to a more regulated capitalism in the United States, which many people forget about how much capitalism was regulated in post-World War II until 1970s, how much the financial sector was regulated, how much protection there was for unions, how really a lot of our manufacturing was done in the United States before it went overseas. So we had this era of regulated capitalism, and we had Keynesian economics was pretty dominant at the time, not neoclassicals. The idea to leave everything to the market was considered quite radical. That changed. And for critical scholars say it changed as, at least in part, a backlash against labor, because there was something called a profit squeeze for a lot of businesses as unions were gaining a lot of power, as there was rising competition from Europe and Japan, third world militancies, all these things were putting a squeeze on businesses. And so one of the things businesses did is they located their production overseas in places like China or throughout the world. China might come a little bit later, but Latin America, a variety of places, in search of cheaper labor. And that's part of the ecological story too, because the ecological story isn't just about the grabbing up of resources from the natural resource sectors. It's also about the outsourcing of production processes, which are highly polluting. So what I wanted to do is take the view from the ecological perspective, because the story has been told from the labor perspective. And to show that from the ecological perspective, if we look at neoliberal development policies, which the developing country was forced to take because of the debt crisis, essentially the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund stepped in and they said, okay, you guys are in a debt crisis. If you want a loan, you have to basically do what we say. Do what we say went under the name of structural adjustment policies, also something which is not very well known unless you take an upper level econ course. And these structural adjustment policies made it so easy for foreign capital to come into places like Africa and Latin America and to control the natural resource sectors, to have the government to pay very low taxes to the governments, to repatriate profits very easily. All those regulations that economic nationalism sought to implement to control the multinational corporations were repealed to make, and this is really the key point, I think, to understand, is that with the ecological crises that we see today, there's an underpinning that's been happening for decades, which has made it extremely easy for multinational corporations and domestic capital to easily exploit natural resources all around the world. The legislation is there in mining legislation, in the land sector, basically anywhere there needs to be property rights.
To sort of, I mean, to take it down to a maybe a little bit more granular level, the book spends a whole chapter talking about Tanzania, and using it as, in some senses, representative of a lot of the dynamics that we're talking about, which I believe the Tanzania chapter follows a chapter which gives a broader overview of some different African economies, but the most time is spent there. Could you talk a little bit about Tanzania, and what's important to understand about the way that some of these dynamics have played out there?
Yeah, so I'll say I didn't choose Tanzania because I thought it was an exemplar of the case study I honestly just chose it because I was a Peace Corps volunteer there. And because I speak Swahili, I knew the country, and I knew that it would be easier for me to get around, to get a grant to do research. So it wasn't because it had some sort of extreme case of land grabbing or anything like that. It was more, okay, this is a country that I'm familiar with. I want to return back to it. And when I started investigating Tanzania, then I could see the same dynamics that were playing throughout Africa in the more microcosm of Tanzania. And in the case of Tanzania, we had, again, set up under the German and British colonial powers, this colonial state that didn't exist before. In countries, in Africa, people lived according to kingdoms or their own tribes. That's how they organized themselves. Colonialism was so disruptive. So in Tanzania, we had a colonial state just artificially put on there, where the administration of it, again, was geared towards controlling the population and controlling the natural resources. And we see the rules, and especially regarding the mining sector and the land, which are the two things I concentrate on for Tanzania, centralized in the sense that taken out of the hands of the people and centralized into the colonial state. And we saw the backlash with Nyerere, who was the post-colonial leader in Tanzania, who was really well respected for his Pan-Africanism, and also well respected because when he got in charge, basically he made sure that Tanzania had a very peaceful takeover. We saw his experiments with African socialism. That's what he called it. And there were maybe some successes. There were a number of things which have been criticized quite a bit. But even under African socialism, resources, the mining sector, and land still were very much under the control of the president, because they had inherited that administrative apparatus. But the difference was, under African socialism, it became nationalized. Like the mining sectors were nationalized. What happened? Well, when, nationalizations throughout the global South, some countries, the investors just pulled out. Like in Tanzania, it led to this basically a total drop in investors, because investors, if you nationalize, if you have the threat of nationalization, people don't want to invest in your country. In other countries, honestly, it led to covert military action on the part of the United States. In Tanzania, I don't think that happened, but there was definitely a drop in the production of minerals and metals because of the withdrawal of investment flows. And Tanzania went into debt. And then we had the era of taking out loans from the IMF and the World Bank, and we had the era of structural adjustments, and nationalizations were banned. The new legislation for mining allowed for like 100% foreign ownership. And in the land sector, which was still concentrated under the control of the Tanzanian government, it made it very easy so investors could come in, make a deal with the government under neoliberalism, and create a lot of problems for the people who were living on the land. Because for the people living on the land, they didn't maybe necessarily have legal protection, or there were a lot of loopholes if they had legal protection. And so it was pretty easy for land grabbing to occur, large scale land investments around agricultural, variety of agricultural crops, And so this time period of land grabbing, this is all happening in the 2000s, maybe 2008 to 2015, we really see a peak. And this is happening all around the world. It got a lot of attention, actually, at this time from a lot of critical scholars, because it results in a lot of people being kicked off their land, a great deal of environmental degradation if there were forests there, water grabbing. And so I focus on land grabbing, and a lot of scholars look at land grabbing as well, because as environmental crises heat up, literally heat up in our world, or countries face food insecurity, like the Middle Eastern countries faced increasing desertification, countries start looking overseas for land that's cheap, easily available, cracked open by neoliberal development policies that have been in place for decades. And the result is a socio-ecological crisis for the villagers and the indigenous people who are living in these countries.
I mean, yeah, the end result of all these sort of dynamics that we've been discussing and that your book looks at is, precisely the degradation of the natures in those countries which have had their economies and their governments changed by transnational investment. And the majority of the benefits of that are flowing towards global North countries like the US, Europe, the UK. But the one of the things that the book highlights that was so interesting to me is that the language of economics doesn't usually take that into account, doesn't usually take the ecological consequences of those policies into account. And you have to make reference to a couple of different ways of even looking at something like gross national product or exchange rates to find one that doesn't paint a false equivalency between the benefits that both of the countries are reaping from this. How is it that the language of like contemporary mainstream economics is so detached from the actual physical consequences of these policies?
It's a really good question, Dan. It's something that I have to explain over and over and over in my classes. It comes, not to dive too much into the academic history, but it really comes back to, again, that post-World War II era. And there was a push for countries to standardize their, what we call the national accounting systems, and to come up with an indicator, the GDP. And this indicator, the growth of this indicator, is what we have decided to base human civilization on, basically. We have completely reified. We've made kind of a deity of this particular indicator. And GDP really is just a measure of the value of all the final products produced in an economy. And there's absolutely nothing in the GDP that accounts for environmental degradation, period. It's just not there. And so really, unless some sort of a good or a service has a dollar sign attached to it, that's the only thing that's counted in the GDP. So that's the big one. It's this, so imagine you're a country that exports timber, okay? Your GDP is gonna go up if you're, even if, people used to live in that forest and used the variety of ecosystem services in that forest for their daily life, they probably, maybe they didn't make money from it, or they didn't produce a good that had a dollar sign to it. But let's imagine that situation where the trees are cut down and the timber is all exported overseas, and most of the profits are going towards a transnational corporation, it's still basically going to make the GDP increase, or likewise, a country could be basing its industrialization off of the military industrial complex. We know some countries like that, and we'll see the GDP, it'll be a big driver of GDP growth.
Yeah, I have more questions. We have been talking for about half an hour now. I do want to know if there's anybody here who has any questions. We do have another microphone. I can toss it out to the audience.
Testing. Oh, wow. Awesome. We were just talking about GDP and it being an indicator that we assert value with. And it brings to mind like just kind of the different value systems we have. And I was wondering if there are sort of, I'm trying to think of how to phrase it, like not an alternative GDP, but one that takes into account like environmental factors such as like, I don't know, pollution growth or how we could kind of like factor that into our, I don't know, value system, I suppose. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And there are very, very smart, concerned people who are thinking on this very issue. And there's been a variety of different indicators. This has just been going, like, people have realized this is a problem for a long time. Even the people who created the national accounting systems and GDP warned against too much reliance on this indicator. What are some that I think are kind of interesting? There's one called the Happy Planet Index. It's just kind of interesting, which looks into, I believe it's people's happiness levels and their environmental sustainability. They incorporate that. There are nowadays, there are a wide variety of socio-environmental indicators that you can look at that are not monetary based. So in my book, I look at material flows accounting, which basically they've done a tremendous job of showing for all the countries in the world from like 1970 until 2019, all the resources that any given country uses. We can look at pollution levels. We can look at ecological footprint as one of them, carbon footprint. Yeah, there's a lot of them. The question is, does GDP still have the power over our policymaking? Very much so. And it still has power over development work.
Why don't we use euphemisms like global north when we could just say European?
That's a really good question. Because I think we would have to say European, we'd have to say America, we'd have to say probably Australia and Canada, and we'd have to say Singapore, probably South Korea at this time. So when we say global north, we typically refer to the income levels of a country, like where it's at in terms of basically the wealth that the country has. But it's a good point that you're bringing up, because if we're going to really think about the global north countries as the ones that were responsible for colonialism, then we're talking about European nations.
This actually, I mean, we have another, yeah. You can do it.
Okay, I can yell.
No, we need to get you for the recording. You can't just, no, you're not getting out of this without
I really am
documentation.
terrified of this microphone. Okay, so my question is about the need for capital to create new markets, right? And the way that what you basically described as like an enclosure of natural resources, forcing people off of their land. And then all of a sudden we've created a crisis in which people who previously did not need money to get goods now need money to get goods. Yeah. Did I get the main idea?
I am definitely hearing your question.
Okay, because I can't figure out where to put the question mark, but if you can answer it, I'd be really happy.
So the general topic about capitalism being expansionary. Yeah, so this is a really big part of what I try to explain in my book is the expansionary dynamics of capitalism, which is behind the push for endless economic growth. I think it's the reason why we have basically made a deity out of GDP is because it really kind of it gives us an excuse for capital accumulation. What you're talking about, capitalism needing markets. So capitalism is expansionary for a wide variety of reasons. Since colonialism, capitalism has needed an outlet for its manufactured goods. Why does capitalism need to go overseas for its manufactured goods? One is just opportunity. It's a bigger market. But two, something that critical scholars have noticed is that sometimes within your own country, you may not be paying your workers enough to afford the goods that you're making. So if this happens, maybe the goods need to go overseas. Capitalism is expansionary for a lot of other reasons too, because natural resources, industrial capitalism has always required natural resources from all around the world. So it's expansionary for that reason. It's expansionary because there's our buildups in the financial sector, and it needs to go all around the globe looking for the highest rates of return. So it's just fundamental. I think that stems from the very beginning of capitalism. Marx called it primitive accumulation, when there were enclosures and the people who used to work in the rural areas had to then become the proletariat class. And I've also heard about that happening with the land grabbing throughout the global South. And that's another issue, because I think in this era of globalization, we see increasingly more and more people pulled into a system where we're all kind of a part of it, like I said at the beginning, as workers, as consumers, but we're definitely not all benefiting equally.
I think some of this is approaching something that your book takes really seriously, which is the rise of semi-peripheral economies. Firstly, I guess for anybody listening who might not be familiar, semi-peripheral, it's a term that comes out of like a world systems theory understanding of international relations. And could you sort of lay out why that school of thought is important to what you're looking at here, but also what's distinct about the rise of some of these semi-peripheral economies and the way that they have changed more recently the dynamics of international capital flow and accumulation?
Okay, this is a really big question. So to talk a little bit about world systems theory, I'm going to make a pitch for it. It's
There we go.
it's a really good theoretical school of thought. It's a lot of deep thinking, a lot of critical deep thinking has gone into this school of thought. Basically, I don't know, in the 1960s, there was this idea, the opposite school of thought called modernization theory. We think of it being kind of on the neoclassical camp. And modernization theory said these post-colonial countries, what they really need to do is engage more with the global North. They need to increase their trade or increase the foreign investment coming in from the global North. And they'll be able to follow the steps that countries like the United States took in their industrialization process, and one day reach this kind of promised land of capitalist consumerism. Literally, it literally says that. And
the religious language is just so interesting. Yeah.
This underpins development theory. In response to that, we had scholars really from Latin America. They were the dependency theorists. And they said, there's no way the countries these post-colonial countries can ever develop like the European countries did, because we'll never be able to colonize everybody else and get their resources and their cheap labor and their slave labor. You know, what happened for Europe and the European countries is a very specific historical circumstance. And actually, if we look at what's happening, our terms of trade, you know, we are exporting our natural resources. We're giving them away basically very cheaply. And we seem to be having to give them away more and more cheaply as time goes on. We're being hurt by the global economy. We have dependent relationships with the global north. We're dependent on the technology. We're dependent on the finance. We're dependent on the international trade. And ultimately, this isn't good for us. And so that's where dependency theory came from. And that's where world systems theory came from. And so world systems theory, it starts from the opposite idea that the problem is within the country, like modernization theory. Modernization theory says basically the problem's in the country. They just have to get their policies right and they can do what we did. World systems theory takes a look at the entire global economy and tries to see how it all functions together. Like they have something called an international division of labor. So you have, at least at the beginning during colonialism, it's changed now. The colonial division of labor is the European countries export manufactured goods. The colonized countries export their natural resources. Nowadays, it's become a bit more complicated because our manufacturing, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it has gone overseas in search of cheaper labor and laxer environmental regulations. So for some countries that received this, and particularly for the countries in Asia that received this, and they also engaged in some regulation on their transnational corporations, they got some concessions from them. They've been rapidly industrializing. And so there was a semi-peripheral category before that, maybe places like Eastern Europe, but now we're this kind of semi-periphery. We can think of like the emerging economies, the ones that are somewhat like in between sub-Saharan Africa and the global north. And if we look at those countries, we see very high material usage, not as high as in the United States, but way higher than a typical African villager. We see much higher levels of industrialization. We see much higher GDPs per capita. And something importantly, we see capital coming from those countries now and being invested globally, but importantly for this issue of imperialism, going into to poorer nations that can offer their natural resources more cheaply.
So what's developing is a sort of, there is an alternative investment structure here that isn't, well, that's actually something that the book interrogates, which I found really instructive, that this alternative, there's something that has the appearance of an alternative investment structure, that the money is coming from, you know, semi-peripheral nations and not necessarily the United States or companies based in the United States. But one of the things that you make a point of is that at the end of the day, this is all still existing within a global order that is dominated, and that all at some point does lead back to usually American, but you know, to use our favorite euphemism, global North economies. Is that an accurate read of what the argument that you make is?
Almost.
Okay,
I would say that it's kind of a complicated argument I make. I look at China and I look at the amount of exploitation of Chinese environment that has occurred as our manufacturing went to China, and how much of China's carbon footprint is actually to produce cheap goods for consumers in the global north. And So I make the case that the rise of a lot of these emerging economies, which China really is the big elephant in the room, they've been in a quite exploited position too. They opened their borders to transnational corporations for cheap labor. They've sometimes in emerging economies, they serve as platforms for their transnational corporations and securing sometimes even resources. There are a couple of instances I read about securing resources for transnational corporations. So there's an entanglement of what I call imperialism from the global north with what's going on in the semi-periphery. But at the same time, the end result for the poorer countries, it's still not very good. The reason why I got alerted to this issue was because I was living as a professor in Cambodia for a year, where there was quite a bit of land grabbing going on. And I was talking with human rights organizations, and estimates of hundreds of thousands of people kicked off of their land. But what I noticed is that most of the investment was actually coming from other Asian countries, Cambodian domestic capital, but also Vietnamese and also Chinese. Those were the three biggest sources, and also places like Thailand and some from Singapore, maybe even Malaysia, and then a small amount from the traditional global north. So in places like Africa, it's from all over the world. It's from Middle Eastern countries, it's from China, maybe Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, the traditional colonial powers. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of somebody who is a villager or an indigenous person and you just got kicked off your land, it doesn't matter to you which country, you know. But there is culpability still with the global north, because it was the global north that really pressured these countries to crack open their mining sectors and their land sectors. And it points to a bigger issue. Everything that we know, all the empirical studies that we know for industrialization shows that as countries start to industrialize, they go overseas to get their resources because it just becomes too much for, you know, their own domestic extraction.
I have two more questions I'd love to get in, but if anybody else has questions or anything we want to talk about, yeah, absolutely.
Just so again, the euphemisms. Of course, none of this, either colonialism in its early stages or industrial capitalism or whatever we've been talking about, is possible without the backing of military force. So, I mean, this is a matter of violent, forceful seizure of property everywhere, and the main source of this violence is European and North American, right?
Yes, well, I'm glad that you brought up military, and one of the reasons why I do mention the physical force aspect of it. But one thing I wanted to try to do with this book is to show that even in the absence of direct military intervention, the way the economy itself is working with just economic policies, it's achieving the same thing. Because I think sometimes people, we think that, okay, with the time period of formal colonialism being over, there can't be something like imperialism. But imperialism can, and this is not at all to discount the role of covert CIA operations in the time of economic nationalism. I do mention that in this book. Or also something is the apparatus of the state as well. And even states in the global South who are very much entangled with foreign investors. Violence is always the stick behind all of this. What's not always known is what is held up as the carrot, which is the language around development, around economic growth, which a lot of these economic policies are being done under the auspices of these of development. So I wanted to kind of expose that side.
Hi, how are you? I just first of all, just thank you for speaking here, giving us all this education. So all this talk about land grabbing, from all these different sort of places from countries in the global north to, I think, as you said, people, countries that might be considered the global south, or like, lower in the global north, or in that in between scale. So it just kind of seems like this is kind of the way of doing things now. Like this land grabbing it's kind of like it seems like a can of worms, right? So like, how does this, like, what's the, like, I guess, like, what's the solution? Like, is there is there a way to regulate this? Is there not a way to regulate this? I guess, like, what would be an answer to this, like, unfettered sort of like land grabbing?
I get your point. In a way, it is the way things are being done now, because a central point I make in my book is that development has been defined since the World Bank and the IMF as something we call export-led development in economics. That means if you want to develop, supposedly you do so through your export sector, which for the places like sub-Saharan Africa meant concentrating in their natural resources, right? So it's a really, really entrenched problem. Let me just think of how to word this. It's a dependency. Remember, I was talking about that thing of dependency theory. A lot of countries in the global South, since colonialism, because their economies were reorganized as exporters of natural resources, and to welcome in foreign investors, that's where a lot of states get their revenues from. So what we have seen in some situation is even states that don't want to do this anymore still end up in this dependent position. I'm not an expert in Latin America, but I have been reading a couple articles lately about some of the leftist governments under Morales and Correa, who were really trying to do something different with the environment. And they did not want to be in this trap of all their profits from their natural resources going to foreign investors. But nonetheless, this kind of dominant dependency overwhelmed, in a sense, even those governments. There's, I think, a lot of people who would say that in the absence of mass social movements, protecting the rights of villagers, of local communities, of indigenous peoples, it's just not going to happen, because it really is the way things are done right now.
I guess maybe to you, I guess, how long of that do you think we have left? Like another like 10, 20 years of that, maybe 30 years?
10, 20 minutes.
10, 20 minutes.
Well, I think it depends what kind of timeline you're looking at. If you're looking at a timeline of what scientifically we need to do in order to stave off the worst of climate change and mass extinction, we're looking at a very critical period of 10 years where we need to start doing things really differently. The estimates that I have seen would be basically net zero, which is a problematic way of saying it for many reasons, the whole net zero thing, but net zero carbon or let's just say zero carbon emissions by 2050 and 50% reduction by 2030.
Could you explain why net zero is a problematic way of thinking about this? Because I actually think it's really related to questions of ecologically unequal exchange and debts that
Yeah. I'll give one example of something that I'm aware of. So there's concern that essentially the biggest polluters can basically keep polluting and buy carbon credits from somewhere else. And there's a lot of problems with this. Some of it, a lot of indigenous groups are concerned about, because if you're going to say, okay, that rainforest is soaking up this much carbon, which can be very hard to measure in the first place, then it might lead to kind of fortress conservation they've talked about, with the indigenous people being kicked off. And so that rainforest now belonging as a carbon credit. And there's a lot of loopholes where it might be I feel like I might be getting into tricky ground here that I need to read up more deeply before I say some of these things on public radio. But I have read some criticisms before that, if a company can give some sort of a projection that they're going to emit this much carbon, and then say that they're going to do this action, that they're going to emit less, that they can get carbon credits for this. Don't fully quote me on that, though.
Yeah.
I know that there's issue. The main issue is that there's just too many loopholes. It gives the biggest polluters the right to try to buy their way out instead of actually making reductions. And that the biggest polluters is not just this issue of total carbon emissions that we're facing. We're also facing pollution from, carbon intensive or greenhouse gas intensive industries, and the environmental injustice that happens around them, because they tend to be in poor neighborhoods with African Americans or Hispanics living in them. So it gets tricky.
Yeah, thank you. I know that wasn't on the fly request for clarification. Yeah. Do we have any other? The question is the cooking.
Yeah, I mean, like I could ask you, and if it's bad, you could just replace it with a more reasonable question.
Okay.
So I guess what I've been thinking about, and I don't like Sean, I don't know where the question mark goes in this one, but I've been thinking a lot about like multinational giant mega corporations like Exxon and Total Gas and Amazon that have the ability to, without state backing, do colonialism in the global South, I guess like neo-colonialism, where they can pull and extract resources. And so I was just like, maybe my question is, when we're thinking about global North, like, should we factor like large multinational corporations that don't necessarily have a specific national home as like their own thing, like Western countries, and then also that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. The thing is, these for a lot of these transnationals, not all of them, not all transnationals that we see in places like Africa are coming from the Western countries. But a lot of them are headquartered in the Western countries, and so probably a lot of their shareholders are getting profits from it. So if we're concerned with the issue of where the profit's flowing, then we should see where their headquarters, who their CEOs are, who their shareholders are, because that tells us who's getting the benefit from the neocolonialism. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's no other questions or any other topics that we want to cover right now, Mariko, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to let folks know when the book is coming out and where they could buy it potentially? You also don't have to.
Well, it's an academic press, so it's ridiculously expensive.
Right.
So get it at your local library.
There we go. Yeah.
It's it'll be out on October 13th. That's the release date.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Thank you.